Well, good morning. We've been making our way through the book of Acts. Last week, we focused in on the origin story of Paul's origin story, right? And if you don't know who Paul is, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it as we go along here, and we'll revisit his story a little bit going on. We found out about Paul that this guy who is the greatest missionary ever. He's a super influential person. He brought the gospel to the whole known world. This guy who did so much, had a very slow start of things, right? But that slow start, that time where Paul learned patience and learned how to seek the Lord, it was a very vital and important part of his life. He had a 14-year runway to get up to speed, to get out on mission, and to become the guy who we think of as Paul, the super apostle, right? But in that time, in that long runway, in those 14 years of waiting, Paul really came to know Jesus. He came to know not just about Jesus, but came to know him and learned what it is to follow him. It's one thing to say, Jesus is Lord, and I will live my life for him, right? But it's a whole other thing to actually do it, right? If you've become a Christian, at some point you just said, I have decided to follow Jesus. And then you probably spent a long time saying, how? How do I do that? I know I have this intention. I want to seek him out. I want to follow after him. I want to live by faith, but I don't always know how. Practice is the challenge for most of us. Practice is the challenge for me. Because of my own weakness and my own stupidity, let's just call it what it is, right? And all the things that get in the way of me following Jesus. Learning how to actually consistently live by faith and walk by faith and seek the Lord every single day is hard. Paul learned the art of following Jesus through a long season of patience and character development, right? But in the end, he learned some important things. Patience is hard for us, and particularly for this generation. It's been hard in every generation, but particularly in the age that we live in, patience and learning to wait on the Lord and to just kind of see our way towards a kind of a robust faith is difficult. Tim Keller, a pastor in New York, who I like, he describes the kind of unique crisis that we face in our age this way. He says this: the crisis is this: despite the incoherent moral cosmology, and don't worry about that doesn't make sense to you, it's fine. Secular culture has created an enormously powerful, constantly immersive moral ecology or moral world through a digital revolution that overwhelms the 2 or 3 hours a week Christians worship and study in church. The amount of time we spend on our phones in a day, the number of images and videos and repetitive slogans we see, makes the most immersive set of practices ever. And I don't think that's an overstatement. It engages the imagination with narratives. It makes the influence and consumption of TV, already a concern a generation ago, look tiny by comparison. Those consuming digital content are being deeply catechized for far more hours a week and far more effectively than anything the church is doing. You get the problem about the world that we live in. It's that we're constantly receiving all sorts of messages about what life should be like and how you should live and what's good, and they're totally contradictory to what Jesus says. And so it's just like competing narratives. It's competing stories. One is just filling us up all the time, and most of us just get 30 minutes of me talking to you, right? And that's not enough. I'm not saying you need me to talk to you more. I'm saying you need to seek the Lord more, okay? The problem is clear. We need to cultivate and develop a patient expectation of who God is and how he's working in the world, a clear sense of what's actually urgent and what's really important and what true strength is, that is just waiting on the Lord, being filled by him. But we are constantly barraged with messages that tell us something else. They shape us and they make us think that what's urgent is just to be strong and content and all the things that culture sells to us, right? And we think that if we don't have those things, how could we be okay, right? And so we're put on this kind of a rat race trying to pursue contentment in a way that will never actually bring us contentment. And it leads us to deny and neglect the calling that we have to just grow in the Lord, spend time with him, trust him more, learn what it is to really walk by faith. And interestingly, what Keller argues, he goes on to argue, is that we need to get over we need to get over the forming influences of our culture by engaging in an alternative moral cosmology, moral ecology, right? Basically, all he's saying is that what we need is we need to be immersed in something that's stronger and more influential, bigger and more robust than the digital messaging constantly coming at us. It's funny how we gather here on Sundays, right? And sometimes people say, this is not, if you're at home and you're worried about COVID, this is not for you. I'm not guilting you into getting to church. Don't worry about it. If you have health concerns, fine. That's not what I'm saying, okay? But when all of this is over, then I am going to start to guilt you. No. What I'm saying is that we gather. A church is the ecclesia. It's like a gathering. It's a called out space. People are called to come together, and we share life together. And the reason that we share life together is because we need to see other people following Jesus. Because the more we see other people following Jesus, the more we see what they're up to, the more we can start to understand that's a way that I can apply this in my life. That's a way that I can see God working in my own life. We just don't know. I just don't know. I don't have enough examples in my life. I particularly noticed this when I was like a young man. And young people generally tend to stay with other young people. I really needed at some point in my life to see older men living life following Jesus because I couldn't figure it out. But to see someone doing something, that's such a more immersive experience. Just a little thought about the church and why it's important. It's also why I just love the book of Acts. Because if we read carefully, we see just pictures of people engaged in regular life, and they're just normal people. We really have to understand this. The Bible is full of just normal people. You could be in the Bible. Like, there's nothing about them that was particularly unique or special. They're just normal people who are full of the Holy Spirit, and they're just following after Jesus. We see portraits of normal men and women doing very normal work, practicing their faith. These saints, like Peter and Paul, they didn't possess anything that we don't have ourselves. So as we continue on in the book of Acts now, we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to finish out chapter 9, and we're going to go through most of chapter 10. And we're going to focus on these passages that are really about Peter's ministry, right? The narrative goes on to Peter for one last time and then mostly shifts to Paul in the upcoming chapters. And what I want to do today is I just want to think for a second about Peter. Think about the way he's practicing his faith, right? Think of him as an example of a person who's following Jesus. Think about the dynamics, the lived dynamic that's going on in Peter's life. Like, how is it playing out, okay? What's Peter doing, and what can we learn about how to live our lives accordingly, how to live according to faith, okay? So we're going to jump in. It's going to be Acts chapter 9, verse 34, okay? Opening his mouth, Peter said, I'm reading 10. I'm on the wrong page. Here it is. Now, as Peter was traveling through all those regions, he came down to the saints who lived at Lydda, and there he found a man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden for 8 years, for he was paralyzed. Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus heals you. Get up and make your bed. Immediately he got up, and all who lived at Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translates in the Greek Dorcas. This woman was abounding in deeds of kindness and charity, which she continually did. And it happened that at the time that she fell sick and died, and when they had washed her body and laid it in the upper room, since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, having heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, imploring him, do not delay in coming to us. And so Peter arose, and he went with them. And when he arrived, they brought him into the upper room, and all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing all the tunics and garments that Dorcas used to make while she was with them. But Peter sent them out and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up, and he gave her his hand and raised her up, and calling the saints and the widows, he presented her alive. And it became known to all over Joppa, and many believed in the Lord, and Peter stayed many days in Joppa with a tanner called Simon. And we talked recently when we've gone through earlier chapters in the book of Acts about healing. And so I'm not just going to go into a whole theology of healing again. You want to know my thoughts on that, just go back, watch some old stuff. So I'm not going to focus too much on that. But I do want to focus again on the lived dynamic of Peter's faith here. We can learn something about how Peter's faith played out. And I think it's important. And that's this. Peter's faith operates in the foreground of his life. Peter's faith operates in the foreground of his life. There's a slide for that, I think. I did a lot of theater growing up. Again, we all know. Yeah, we know. I did a lot of theater growing up, and I remember a few productions where we had like really elaborate sets, right? Really elaborate sets. So like people would be up 25 feet in the air, they'd pop out a little door in the set, you'd be like, oh, how'd he get there? That's amazing, so cool, right? Or we'd have dancers who'd be on big platforms like 12 feet up in the air, very dangerous. I don't know how the insurance worked out for all that, but it worked out, it was fine, nobody got hurt that I know of. On one show, we built like a platform out into the audience, so there'd be like chase scenes all through the audience. It was pretty cool. An elaborate set made for a very visually interesting production. But in the end, everything that was important to the play, to the show, to the drama, it happened on the flat, boring foreground of the stage. All the action played out right there. I think it's interesting the way we talk about faith sometimes. I would argue that many of us have kind of a deficient doctrine of faith, or an idea of what faith really is. For many of us, we talk about faith. When we talk about faith, we're talking about basically a set of ideas that kind of form the background of our lives, the scene, the setting of our lives. Faith functions by defining what's ultimately true, as in, like, I have faith that God exists, right? That's something that I have faith in. I have faith that Jesus is Lord. I have faith that the word is true. And I believe all of that, and I believe all of that is essential to believe in order to practice one's faith. All those facts are an important part of a Christian worldview, and understanding that stuff matters. But here's the thing. All of that matters, but believing all of that, I don't think really means that you are practicing your faith. Because faith operates not just in the background, in our worldview and what we assume to be true about the world, but in the foreground of our life. Faith makes a difference in our day-to-day lives. Faith plays out in our day-to-day lives. Peter is living this out. Peter went through life. He's going all over the place. He knows all this stuff about God, but then he sees problems. Dead people, people who are sick, haven't stood up for 8 years. Most of us would just say, well, there's nothing to be done. Such is life. That's the way things work. But Peter's faith led him to do something. He prays. He prays for these people. He asks God. God, who can so easily be relegated to the background like a piece of set in our inner world. He asks God to take center stage. Do something, God. I'm not going to do it. You do it. He's got faith that God is going to take the foreground, come into the center. Peter expects that God is going to be more than a member of the chorus or a silent actor, but a major character in the drama of his life. He expects that. That is his expectation. So I guess the question for us is, do we? Do I? Do I expect my faith that God exists to actually make any impact in my day-to-day? To make any impact in the way that I go around in my life? Because my expectation and your expectation of who God is and how he operates is going to affect how you live. It's going to affect how you arrange your life if you believe that he's actually at work in the world. Even beyond this, I think we see something really important about faith. Peter didn't just say, okay, well, I expect God to act. Therefore, I expect him to play video games with me and buy me a yacht, right? Right? That wasn't his expectation. Actually, Peter not only expected God to act, but he expected God to act in such a way. He expected God to go around. I think I deleted my point. Can you get the next one? He had faith, and he understands that by faith, that his faith is meant to serve other people, that he's supposed to go around and serve other people. Peter expected God to act, and so he went around finding people who had a need and serving them. Like he finds a man bedridden for 8 years. Peter knew, he's walking around, he knows right away, this is the sort of person who God can help, right? He comes around, he hears about a dead person. Death is terminal. We all know that, right? but he understood, no, this is somebody who God can help. This is someone who God cares about. Faith serves others in love, right? I mean, I'm sure, like, God's going to take care of us. That's part of faith. Knowing that and believing that and trusting in that, that's part of a robust faith. But honestly, the better part of faith and the better part of, like, experiencing faith is understanding, man, God acts in the world and he cares about people and he wants me to partner with him to reach out in love and service of other people. We're going to see faith growing if we go ahead and take those sorts of risks to serve other people in his name. John Wimber, love him or hate him, has a saying, faith is spelled R-I-S-K. I'm actually sure every preacher has that saying because we steal things from each other. So that's a risk we're willing to take. That was funny. Faith is spelled R-I-S-K. You know, the thing about, like, theater, and it's like the sort of thing that I would have anxiety dreams about when I was a kid, is that you go out on stage, like, and you're a part of the play, and then you start the scene, and if the other person doesn't come into the scene, you're going to look like an idiot, right? I've done that before. People are late. They're, like, having trouble changing, and I don't know, whatever. And you just have to improvise. I think so oftentimes I see hurting people around me. You know, I see people who have real needs, who could really, like, use a word of encouragement, who could use me, like some prayer, like who could use someone who actually cares about them enough to just talk to them, spend time with them. And a lot of times I do this thing in my mind where I see people and I think, what can I really do to help them? You ever think like that? Like, and so a lot of times we just say, so I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to do anything to help people. I'm just going to play it safe because I can, from a distance, pray for them. I'm not going to go up to them and say, hey, look, I see you have a need. I see you're in pain. Like, can I just pray with you and maybe God will do something? But so oftentimes we're just so afraid, what if God doesn't show up? Like, what if he isn't going to do anything? What if he doesn't care as much about my family or my friends as I do? But you know what? God is loving. And if we have faith that God is acting in the world, then we're going to have faith that he cares about other people just as much as we do. And when we see people who are hurting, he sees them hurting too. And so we can just partner with him, understanding that we can pray for people, care for people, intervene in their lives, look out for them, and that he's going to show up in the middle of that. That's part of just partnering with God. And I think that's what we really do when we step out in faith. We're partnering with God to bring about the stuff that he said he desires to see in the world. And it does involve some risk. But I think we just need to be people who like that risk. Who like that risk, because the more we take that risk, the more we're going to see actually God does show up. He does show up. Let's keep reading. Going on, Acts 10:1. Okay, so this is like a big, long narrative, so I'm going to get through a lot of it here, and we'll talk about it. Now there was a man at Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion who was called of what was called the Italian cohort, a devout man and one who feared God with all of his household. And he gave many alms to the Jewish people and prayed to God continually. About the 9th hour of the day, he clearly saw a vision, an angel of God who had just come in and said to him, Cornelius. And fixing his gaze on him and believing and being much alarmed, he said, what is it, Lord? And he said to him, your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now dispatch some men to Joppa to send for a man named Simon, who is also called Peter. He is staying with a tanner named Simon. That's confusing. Whose house is by the sea. And when the angel who was speaking with him had left, he summoned the 2 of his servants and a devout soldier of those who were in his personal attendance. And after he had explained everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. On the next day, as they were on their way and approaching the city, Peter went up to the household about the 6th hour to pray, but he became hungry and he was desiring to eat. But while they were making preparations, he fell into a trance, and he saw the sky opened up and an object like a great sheet coming down, lowered by 4 corners to the ground. And there were on it all kinds of 4-footed animals and crawling creatures of the earth and birds of the air. And a voice came to him, said, Peter, get up, kill and eat. But Peter said, by no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything unholy and unclean. Again, a voice came to him a second time. What God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy. This happened 3 times, and immediately the object was taken up into the sky. Now, while Peter was greatly perplexed in mind as to what the vision which he had seen might be, behold, 3 men who had been sent by Cornelius, having been asked directions to Simon's house, appeared at the gate. And calling out, they were asking whether Simon, who was also called Peter, was staying there. And while Peter was reflecting on the vision, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are looking for you. Get up, go downstairs, accompany them without misgivings, for I have sent them myself. Peter went down to the man and said, behold, I am the one you're looking for. What is the reason for which you have come? And then Cornelius, they said, Cornelius, a centurion and a righteous man, a God-fearing man, well spoken of by the entire nation of the Jews, was divinely directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and hear a message from you. So he invited them in, and he gave them lodging. So quickly, just to recap, right, because a lot's gone on, we're introduced to a man named Cornelius. He lives in Caesarea. He's a Roman centurion, a Roman soldier. He's a little bit of a rare bird among Roman soldiers because he's really into God. He's a really devout, religious man. He and his whole household are devoted to finding God, to seeking after him. And he's particularly into this Jewish God, Yahweh, right? To the point where he gives money to the Jews. He's not really allowed to worship with them in the same way that they worship, right? Because they're a little bit exclusive. Right? He's a Roman. He's kind of separate. He's not born a Jew, so he's not really allowed, but they'll take his money. That's okay. You can worship God from a distance. And so this man, he's just doing his thing, and all of a sudden he has a vision. He sees an angel who tells him that God has heard his prayers. And he should send some men to a town called Joppa, a nearby town, to find a guy named Peter. And he does so on the double. The next day, the men are coming from Cornelius to Simon Peter's house. Peter excuses himself from whatever's going on in the house. He goes up to the rooftop to pray around lunchtime. And when he's about to quit because he's hungry and it's time to eat, he suddenly falls into a trance. The word in Greek is ekstasis, like he's just having this ecstatic vision. And he sees all kinds of animals, like lowered on a sheet, running around. You know, the kinds that, like, religious Jews weren't allowed to eat because they have rules about the things that they can eat. And he hears a voice that says, and I'm paraphrasing, you hungry? Go ahead. Have a bite. And Peter says, well, no, not me. Like, I'm religious and we have rules about these things. And then God says, yeah, I know, but what God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy. And then that happens 3 times just to make the point. And as Peter, he thinks about this, it says he's greatly perplexed. He doesn't know what this is all about. He understands what happened, but he doesn't understand what it means. And then immediately, he hears these men sent by Cornelius calling out, shouting at the gate, asking to talk to him. Have you ever felt like you just don't know how to listen to God? Like how to follow, how to be confident in what you're doing, how to be confident in how to live your life? You ever felt like you don't understand how to partner with God, how to have faith in him, how to trust him, how to know what the right thing is to do? Of course you have. I feel that way all the time. We feel that way all the time. Look, Peter was a man of faith, right? An exemplary one. But that does not involve him having some supernatural capacity to understand what God is doing. If you want to live a life of faith, you don't need to be smarter or more anything than you already are. But you do need this. You need a vision of what God is doing in the world. That's what he had. See, faith, the expression of it, the lived dynamic of faith, it is guided by vision. Now, let me make something clear. I'm not saying that in order to follow Jesus, you need to have like some ecstatic trance vision, like Peter. I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply saying this. Your action in the world and my action in the world, your partnership with God is properly shaped by an understanding of what he's about and what he's doing. Well, how do we know what he's about? How do we know what he's doing? How do we know what he says? You know because you have this. You have this. This is the word of God. It is an account, really a chronicle of what God has done from the beginning, how he's engaged with people, and it lays out a framework for how he's continuing to do it. Some of it's narrative, some of it's wisdom, some of it's letters from people of faith. All of it is pointing to us to a way to develop an understanding of what God is all about. Who he is, what his character is like, and what sorts of things he's trying to do in the world. And this stuff can form the basis of us having a vision. It is like the raw material that we work with as people in order to discern what he's doing and what we should be doing. If you're going to be putting your faith into practice, then you need to have a vision of what God is up to in the world. And that needs to come from God's revelation of himself, which you have right here. What a blessing. It'll also be shaped by prayer, time with God, listening to him. But we start in the word and we never leave the word. We never get over the word. We stick in the word and then God brings it to life as we seek him out and as we pray and as we get to know him all the more. He's the same yesterday, today, forever. And so we know what he's like. And he's been doing something in the world yesterday, today, and forever. And he's going to do it until it's done. We're calling this series through the book of Acts a peaceful invasion. I titled that because as I read the book of Acts, that's kind of what I understand God's mission in the world to be. He's coming into the world. He's making himself known to people who are far away. It's an invasion, really. It's an invasion of our privacy, of our space. Hey, God, you were up there. We were down here. Well, things were fine. Now you want to come in and really just like pour out your spirit and set people free. And that makes some people uncomfortable, right? He's invading, but he's doing it peacefully. That's a vision of what God's action is like in the world to me. And I find it fascinating. Paul had a vision. Paul had a vision of what God was doing. He talks about several kind of different ways that he thinks about it. But one that I really like is 1 Corinthians 5:14. He says this, the love of Christ controls us. Having concluded this, one died for all, therefore all died, and he died for all, so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. This idea that Paul had, it formed a vision for his life. What am I supposed to be doing, Lord? How am I supposed to be living my life? I'm going to be living in such a way that I don't live for myself, but for the sake of the one who died for me. That formed a vision for how he was in the world. Paul, he was listening to the word. He was praying. He was following after Jesus. He was practicing faith. He came filled up with this vision of what his life could be, a vision that guided his actions in the world. The love of Christ compels me. What is your life for? What is your vision for your life? What's shaped it? What's good about it? Is it based in what God reveals about what it is to partner him and have faith in him? You need a vision for how you understand your purpose and God's action in the world and how you can partner with him. You have a vision for life, whether you've thought about it that hard or not. I don't know. Maybe it's that you want to get rich. Maybe it's that you want to have a certain number of kids and retire in a certain place, you know. Everybody's got, and I'm not bashing any of that. Look, there's a lot of things that go on in life. But I think fundamentally we have to decide, what is God doing in my life? We have to have our action in the world guided by an understanding of who he is and how he works so that we can understand how we can partner with him. Let's keep reading. Acts 10:24. Let's find it. There we go. On the next day, he got up and he went away with them, and some of the brethren from Joppa accompanied him. On the following day, he entered Caesarea. Now Cornelius was waiting for them, and he called together his relatives and close friends. And when Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet and worshiped him. But Peter raised him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am just a man." And as he talked with him, he entered and he found many people assembled. And he said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or visit him. And yet God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean. That is why I came without even raising an objection when I was sent for." So I asked, for what have you sent me? And Cornelius said, well, 4 days ago at this hour, I was praying in my house during the 9th hour, and behold, a man stood before me in a shining garments, and he said, Cornelius, your prayers have been heard, and your alms have been remembered before God. Therefore, send to Joppa to invite Simon, who is also called Peter, to come to you. He's staying at the house of Simon the tanner by the sea. So I sent for you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. Now then, we are all here present before you to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. You notice something here. Peter had like a vision from God, like a revelation of who God is. And it's clear to him that God is not going to call things unholy that God is called holy anymore, right? God is calling things holy that previously would not have been thought of as holy. That's what's clear to him, which isn't really helpful in terms of life instructions. That's all he's got to go off of, right? He's perplexed about how all that's going to play out. Like, what does that mean for my life, God? Okay, you've told me this thing about who you are and what you're like, what you're doing in the world, but I don't know how I make that actionable, right? See, we tend to think that a vision from God, like having a sense of what God is doing in the world, is going to be like receiving a map, right? Like receiving a map. Like all we need to do is just read it, and then we'll go along and we'll know exactly what to do, and we'll have all this confidence, right? Because if we have something from God, if we have a revelation from God, then that should just be directly led into action. I should know what my purpose is. It should be clear. But Peter shows us something else. He shows us that faith is less like having a map and more just like knowing what landmarks are. If someone took away your GPS, what would you do? I couldn't survive anymore. When I was 16 years old, I moved to Connecticut, and I had just gotten my license. I gamed the system because I got it in California, and then we moved to Connecticut, and I had my California license, and so I just drove on it in Connecticut, even though I had to be like 16 and a half to drive in Connecticut. I broke some rules. I'm glad I didn't get caught. I think I would have been in a lot of trouble. I didn't actually know, to my credit. Anyways, my parents were so trusting of me. Thanks, Mom and Dad. But I made some bad choices. One of the bad choices was that I just decided one day when I was 16, I was just going to drive to New York City, right? Because that's not hard. If you've been to New York and driven in it, you know that it was designed by the most sadistic people in the world. There is no getting around New York City, right? If you just had a few landmarks to navigate through in New York City, you're going from Connecticut to New York City and trying to get back, you would be in Staten Island. That's where everything ends. Everything ends in Staten Island. You're like, I paid $40 to get here on the tolls, and I have no idea where I am or how to leave. I guess I'll just move in. It's really difficult, right? And I remember the second time I went to New York City, I had just somebody with me who sort of knew what they were going, and I would have been totally lost. Then I had a MapQuest that I printed out, because you had to say, oh, here are my directions, and you print it out. That made the trip so much easier, right? But the thing is, that's just not what it's like following God. We don't have our step-by-step directions. We don't have Siri or whatever, or Google telling us what to do at every step. Having a vision from God and making it actionable, it's less like getting a map and more just like knowing a few landmarks, like a tree or a mountain on the way. Like the way you used to do directions. You go to the 4th light, take a left at the McDonald's, and then you're going to go up, and there's going to be this weird thing, and you're going to have to veer right. That's what it's more like when we have a vision from God and what's going through life is like. See, Peter has this vision. He understands, okay, I see God is doing something. It's really awesome, but I don't know what's going to go on. I don't know how it's going to play out until life actually happens. He comes out of this vision, and he hears someone calling his name. And these are not the sort of people who normally would be calling his name, not the sort of people who would normally associate with, right? But he had this vision. God's doing something new. He had the shape, the landmark, the kind of general idea of what that sort of thing would look like. He just sees the landmark, and at that point, then he sees the landmark. He says, okay, God's no longer calling things unholy. He's renewing things and opening things up. And here are these people who I think are pretty unholy. He recognizes what's going on. Had Peter not had the vision, he wouldn't have recognized it. He begins to make sense of it. Acts 10:28, it says, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him, and yet God has shown me that I should not call anything unholy or unclean that he's called holy. That is why I came without even raising an objection when I was there. So I ask you, for what reason have you sent me?" See, these people are not Jews, right? And he says it right here. He says, under normal circumstances, had I not had this vision, I would never have come into this house. I would never have followed you to this place because I'm religious. Like, we have rules about these things. It was not okay for people like Peter to be associated with non-Jews. That's not the course of life he would have chosen. But because he had this vision from the Lord, he recognizes God's leading me along the way. I can see the marks along the way. What he has told me, what he's filled me up with, this vision of what he's doing, all of a sudden I see it in life. And so I can go confidently into this situation, which I'm not comfortable with and is not normal for me. But I say, God has led me here because I have a previous understanding of what God's doing. And then he goes on, right? And we're not going to finish out the rest of 10, but he just says this. Opening his mouth, Peter said, "I most certainly understand now," not before, but now, "that God is not one to show partiality. But in every nation, the man who fears him and does what is right is welcome to him." We're going to dive deep into that part of Acts and the rest next week, because there's a lot of theological importance there and a lot of things that we need to deal with in doctrine. But I just really love to see how faith plays out in Peter's life, right? He's not this guy who he doesn't wake up in the morning and just say, "Oh, I have an appointment with God here, 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 here." No, he's a person who wakes up in the morning. He gets something from the Lord, a word from the Lord, a vision for what God's like, and then he just goes through his life and he recognizes the landmarks along the way. And it's in that recognition that he begins to actually have understanding of what God's up to. I am such a controlling person, right? I'm the sort of person who naturally, I don't like to be embarrassed like just me. I know that's a unique problem I have. I don't like to take risks. I don't like to, I don't like a lot of the things that faith requires of me, right? It doesn't come naturally to me to not have a direction all the time in life. But faith, because it has a clear vision of who God is, what he's like, and then begins to see what God is doing, it's able to understand the times. It's able to recognize God working because it puts those things together, a vision and the action of God in the world, and it takes those things and brings about understanding. All of a sudden, when Peter has this, his perplexity, his confusion, it's gone, right? It's gone. And he's able to make this extremely confident pronouncement about what God is doing. And it's amazing. He says, "I understand that God is not one who show partiality, but every nation, the man who fears him and does what is right, is welcome to him." That was a bold statement in the context of Second Temple Judaism. It was a big thing to say. But he was so confident of it because, again, he has this vision and he sees God working in the world, and then he can go and understand. He can go and see what God is up to. I think all of us, I am particularly in my life, so obsessed with just knowing what is next. But I find that the more I just sit with God and just say, "Lord, would you just shape my thoughts? Would you teach me what's good, what's admirable, what's worth focusing on?" And then the more I go through life just thinking, "Okay, Lord, I just want to recognize what you're doing," then I have confidence to understand what he's up to. I want to leave you with one other word, as the worship team comes up here, one other word from Paul in 2 Corinthians, right? He had that vision that's just the love of Christ compelling him and everything, right? And he says this just a few verses later. "All of this is a gift from God,
who brought us back to himself through Christ. And God has given us this task of reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. For God made Christ, who never sinned, to be an offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. See, Paul had a very clear understanding of what God was doing in the world. God is reconciling people to himself. Now, understanding that is not saying, Paul, just be here at this time and reconcile this person, and then you got another appointment here and reconcile that person, right? It's not that sort of thing. But Paul had a clear idea. This is what God's up to. And so I can move out in confidence. When I see people far from God, I can be a reconciler. I can be someone who can speak life to them, who can offer them to know Jesus. We're so timid because we think we need more information than we have. I would argue that we just need to be full of a sense of what God is doing. He's doing this work of reconciliation. And we can go out as ambassadors. An ambassador doesn't know what a conversation is going to be like, but an ambassador knows what the goal is. An ambassador knows and can be bold in pursuing the aims that they're called to pursue in the world. God is making a plea through you to the world. If you need a vision for your life, there's one right there, straight out of the Word, something that you can partake in. You can go around finding people in pain, loving them, speaking this gospel to them, saying, I see you are far from God. I see you are either confused by who he is, or you hate him, or you're angry at the world. And I know of somebody who is dying so that you can be reconciled with God. I don't need someone to tell me that I can give that message. I know that God's up to that in the world everywhere. And so anywhere where I walk in and I see hurting people, I can speak that to them. Anywhere where you see people who are lost and alone, you can be bold enough to go ahead and pray with them and tell them about the reconciling work of Jesus. But if you don't have that in your head, then when those landmarks come along and those people are in your life, you're just going to miss it. There's no GPS along the way. There's no GPS. We have a message and we sit with it and it marinades and it forms the vision for our life of what we can do. We can partner with God to bring this gospel forward, to share it with people who need it. But we have to have the confidence to know that that's what God's up to. And so when I see people who are in need, I can go in and just on behalf of God as an ambassador, offer that to them. Again, I'm a timid person. I don't like to talk to people as much as I stand up in front of people. It's a weird thing that I do with my life. But the more I think about Lord, what are you up to? Like, what are you up to in the world? The more I get a strong sense that he wants to use me, and he wants to use you, and he wants to use this church to reach into a culture that is hurting. And as much as I look at, Seattle, the suburbs of Seattle right now, and I think, boy, this is a little bit of a dark place. You sure you want us to be here, Jesus? Like, it seems a little crazy at times. I can understand that the times that we're living in, God is about the same thing he's always been about. He's reconciling people, even people very far away, people who are like doing their hardest to live unholy lives apart from God, even enemies of him. He says, and God is offering peace and reconciliation even to those people. If I don't have a strong vision of what God's doing in the world, then it's just going to feel like one hit after another. Like life is going to feel painful in a secular place like we live in, right? It's going to hurt to live here if I don't understand that, no, even in these moments of difficulty, there's opportunity because God is doing something. So I'm going to be bold enough to go in and step and share with people who are even angry at me, even think that I am an idiot, because I see that God is at work even in crazy, difficult places. If you don't have that vision, you're not going to recognize what the Lord is doing. You're not going to know what to do with your time. So, Lord, I just pray for all of us, Lord, as we head out this week, God, let us just be immersed in your word. Let us hear from you, God. God, we don't need to know what tomorrow brings or what the day after that's going to be like. We don't need to know how everything is going to come together, Lord. We simply need to know that you are doing something in the world. You're not just set dressing. You're not just a God who sits in the background. You're a God who comes into the foreground and you partner with us, Lord. You've called us ambassadors, Lord, and we have a message and a purpose. And so we can go out and be directed by you and discern what you're doing in the world. God, that feels like far too messy of a process, but you use it, and you've used it for so long, Lord. You lead people along moment by moment, Lord. Lord, teach us the humility to be led by you. God, and just capture us with the beauty of your gospel, with the beauty of your plan for this world, Lord. You could turn this world around, Lord. You could bring people to yourself, Lord, even people who are far from you in our workplaces, in our families. Lord, you care about them. You love them. You serve them. You died for their sake. Lord, let us go boldly with that message, recognizing when people are against you, that is exactly where you want to reconcile. When people are far from you, that is exactly where you want to bring your gospel. Lord, let us be ambassadors of you, Jesus. Pray that. Amen.